All right, we're running. Hello, everybody. My name is Takorian Hurd, and I'll be going over our Lab 2 assignment, the Buffer Overflow Vulnerability Lab. Let's get this started. All right, so the lab goals for this was basically to exploit a given vulnerable C program, stack.c, by using the data file generated by the exploit.c file that we were supposed to write code for. This provided an intuitive process for us to visualize what a Stack Overflow is and how exactly you're supposed to get it. So the methodologies that we use are basically what was used during the Morris worm attack or any type of buffer overflow attack that we'll be going to. These are kind of the basic steps of getting that result. So for the lab for the lab setup, we set our stack randomization to 0. So what stack randomization is, it's just a defense mechanism to defend against buffer overflows. It basically randomizes the starting point of your stack. So if you're trying to guess it, it makes it a lot harder, nearly impossible. So from there, we compiled our stack C using the compilation command right there. Is basically saying compile this, enable the executable stack, and turn off the stack protector. So with that, those are just more defenses against buffer overflow. The stack protector being a defense. The executable stack, it's basically saying that I can execute my shellcode from that stack. And yeah, that's pretty much all that has to do with that. For the next thing, I escalated my privileges of that stack.c using just my privileges from the root shell. So yeah, escalate that to 4755, which basically gives me access to that file. I can read it, I can read the file, and I can execute the file, but I cannot write to that file from my regular user account. And our goal is basically to escalate that privilege to be able to write to it by using that stack. All right, we were given the shell code and partially coded exploit.c, which is the basis of this assignment. Is basically to write the code in exploit.c to be able to generate our bad file with the appropriate content so that we can overflow that buffer and get a shellcode result. All right, so here are the basic steps of what I did to get my results. I used the GDB debugger first to find the size of stack.c's buffer, and upon finding that size, I came to the conclusion that it should be close enough to the stack pointer within 100 bytes or so to actually flood that buffer. Next, I went to the exploit.c code, and I basically guessed the offsets from there to get like an approximation of where that buffer should be. So we would land in the middle of the buffer somewhere, and then trigger a bunch of nops commands that would make a what you call a nop sled. So what nops does is it basically goes through that instruction, not executing anything, but just going to the next instruction. That's all it is. And from there, it would slide all the way down to the shellcode, which would actually execute and give us what we needed as far as the buffer overflow would go. So after a ton of guesses, I was able to get the shellcode running and just test that against other defense mechanisms, such as the stack randomization and the stack protection and things like that. So step 1, I basically used obj dump and GDB to get an approximate size of the buffer and stack C. Pretty self-explanatory. I wanted to use 2 different methods to get the most accurate result there. My result being 32 bytes allocated to the buffer, and with that, EBP would be 4 bytes away from that, and the return address would be 4 bytes away from that. So I found that the return address was 40 bytes away from the actual buffer. So that helped me conclude that just from the size of the stack itself to make sure that I had the right amount of space that I could use when making my attack code. Okay, step two. So I left one's article provided a function that was basically an assembly function to return the address of the stack pointer. So what you see there is has it at the very top over there. But yeah, that function basically returned the address of that stack pointer, and from there you added that result with a guessed offset. So you could set this offset to whatever number within about 100 or so bytes away from that stack pointer, and hopefully land and somewhere in your buffer where it would trigger that knob sled and go all the way back to your shell code.
Oh yeah, go there.
Yeah. So continuing, let's see. As we go from offsets within 100 or so bytes away. Yep. So step 4, what I basically did, pretty much what I explained there. I triggered that knob sled going back to my shell code, and from there, it would trigger the shell code and run that shell from the terminal. So let's see next. I'll load that. All right. So after running that shell code, I posted results right here. Kind of got a little. The results were a little weird. I really couldn't tell from comparing my results with LF1's results if my shell code produced the right shell or if it was in some type of loop or whatever it was. But anytime that I would print out or anytime that I would write, let's say like a Control-C command, anything like that, it would basically write the bin/bin//sh, telling me that it wasn't a shell. So I concluded that it wasn't a shell from there, and exiting out of that would bring me back to my seed shell that was previously in. So it was basically the same as running the shell code itself. So I concluded that it wasn't a shell code there. All right. For the last step, I basically tested my exploit.c file with the defense mechanisms around buffer overflow. So the stack randomization, it basically completely destroyed my exploit.c. So it yielded segmentation faults. There was no way that I could generate any type of shell from that. Weirdly enough, with testing against stack protection and the non-executable stack, I was able to generate a buffer overflow. Let it be known that that was with stack randomization disabled. So I'm pretty sure with it enabled that there would have been a way for me to generate a buffer overflow with that. So, conclusion. Basically learned the methodologies and processes of carrying out a buffer overflow attack. It's a very long process. Learned how the stack works and got a way more in-depth analysis of how it's supposed to allocate data and manage that data through different function calls. A couple of command line tools such as obj dump and gdb debugger. The disassembly function I had no idea existed now, and I'm glad I do. And kind of refreshed on what shellcode was and got a refresh on the assembly functions that you could use for that. So all in all, it was a pretty successful lab.